So, Wharfe, woes and trout tales. I should, I guess, perhaps introduce myself in terms of the Wild Trout Trust, which maybe quick show of hands. Who's heard of the Wild Trout Trust? Oh, that's better than I thought. Good for that. So we are not an angling organisation, although quite a few of us are anglers and work quite heavily with anglers. But we are a small, I would say, perfectly formed environmental charity that is very keen to do good for rivers in terms of habitat. And we use the trout, myself being an aquatic ecologist, I'm very keen on this. All of our work is underpinned by sound science, part of my research and conservation officer role. And we use trout as a sentinel or totemic species to tell us something about the ecosystem within which it's living. So a healthy trout population should reflect a healthy, functional river ecosystem. And that's in part because trout, people tend to think about trout, anglers tend to think about trout. But of course, the majority of trout are about this big and even smaller than that. And we need to think about their whole life cycle if we want to think about a healthy, sustainable population. So the requirements for trout eggs in the bottom right-hand corner here are very different from the fry and the alvins and the other juveniles and the adults. The eggs need good, clean, well-oxygenated gravels over the winter when the eggs bake low and slow in these smaller streams or rivers that actually retain some gravel. The next stage is the alvin. So this little stage here, the weakest link in the trout life cycle, remember that point. They don't actually like flowing systems, they quite like it where it's still. They need refugia in that river system. And then as the trout get bigger, the fry tend to like shallow, fast, rippling water. And as they get bigger and bigger and bigger, they tend to like deeper and slower systems, but with flowing water to bring their food to very efficient feeders. So what trout need is a habitat mosaic. And this is a picture of the Wharfe with a reasonable habitat mosaic. So we've got a nice deep section of water at the front there and a pool that drifts out into a nice shallow ripple at the back there. We've got overhanging cover on the left-hand side here. We've got a series of willow islands around there, and we've actually got a side channel going into that lovely dark shade around a diverse riparian tree flora. When I say riparian, that's that interface between land and water, which is incredibly important. So there's a nice habitat mosaic there, and you can pretty much eke out the whole of the trout life cycle within that one photograph. In good habitat, we might expect typical survival rates as follows. The eggs themselves have evolved to be amazingly good structures. So 80 to 90% survival if the conditions are good. The fry, however, as they swim out, the weakest link, as I said, less than 5%. And that's why trout lay lots of eggs, because they're overcompensating for losses that occur at some point during the life cycle. Get past the fry stage, and we get up to 30%, 30 to 50% per annum. That's in good habitat. Unfortunately, that habitat mosaic on rivers is quite often missing or quite often fragmented. So here's me being a bit cheeky. This is another section of the Wharfe where I would suggest the habitat is quite lacking. It's been canalised here, so it's been straightened. We've got this very long section of glide. I'm stood on a bridge, it goes behind me as well for perhaps 3 times the distance. Very few features there. Yes, we've got a bit of overhanging cover on each bank, but in terms of the bed of the river and the surface of the river there, that suggests it's pretty homogeneous. So what we do as the Wild Trout Trust is try and identify where we might have population bottlenecks. Wherever that mosaic isn't available to the trout, be it limited juvenile habitat, limited spawning habitat, limited adult habitat, those bottlenecks have a marked impact upon the trout population. And the trout, as I said, is a sentinel species, so the trout suffering, the predators of the trout are suffering as well, and it could indicate other issues, not just habitat. So, when I talk about Wharfe woes, shouldn't have had that extra millennium shortbread. When we talk about any river, in fact, particularly the Dales rivers, we could talk about it in terms of death by 1,000 cuts. We've heard some great talks this morning about some of the issues that are impacting. You could whittle that 1,000 cuts down to about 3 key issues. I've listed those here, and that's why I've got this 3-legged bar stool on the right-hand side. Water quantity, water quality, and habitat. So hopefully we've got a good handle on the water quality aspect from Rick and from Martin so far. Water quantity, perhaps Tim will come back and tell us more about that. For the majority of the time, we at Wild Trout Trust consider habitat. Of course, those 3 things are what I would say are interactive, and there's feedback there as well. So if there's too much water coming down the system, then that could have a very serious impact upon the water quality, the habitat quality in terms of stripping out gravels from a particular stretch of river. Of course, the topic at the moment is drought. If we haven't got any water in there, then obviously the amount of habitat available is vastly reduced. So what can we do as the Wild Trout Trust? Well, that can be quite challenging, and we have constraints in a modern landscape. So here's a section of the Wharfe. Should be very familiar to you all by now, especially as we've been looking at this map for most of the morning. So here's Ilkley, the town of the moment, perhaps not for the reasons that it would hope for. And you can see that the river is very tightly constrained there. We're looking at about 4.5 kilometres of distance, but the river is forced right as it comes into Ilkley, and then it's forced left as it goes through Ilkley, and it's pinned between roads and paths as it goes through Ilkley, and it has to go through bridges in Ilkley. And then it gets a nice, long, straight 2.5 kilometre run down to Crook Farm. And actually the river wants to go straight on at that point and wend across the floodplain down in this bottom right-hand corner. But no, it's forced to the right and pinned against the side of the valley for historic reasons, for contiguous parcels of agricultural land. So it's not surprising that the river is constrained in that landscape because of all that urban development. So let's go and look at it somewhere much more pretty, a little even further up, and even more pretty than here. So we've got Buckton over there and Hubberholme up the top there. It's still not great. I would argue that the Wharfe is pretty much constrained by man from about here all the way down. Go upstream from Hubberholme, that was my opening slide shot, my title slide shot. It's a pretty river up there, I'll give you that, and it's probably in the right place in the landscape. But below Hubberholme Bridge, and it's straightened and it's bent round into one side of the floodplain or the other. It's forced through various bridges. Even when you get down below Buckton, it's pinned to one side of the river. One side of the valley, and then it's forced across the other side of the valley and trundles down there. Again, historical movements for agriculture. It's been shifted over there for about 200 years. If you take that particular point on the map there, then this is what it looks like. That is a very long, sweeping, engineered bend designed to keep the river going in that direction and not let it go to the right, where it wants to go. So all of that right-hand bank there is boulder revetment. It's pinning the river, setting it in aspect. So for the sort of stuff that we want to do in terms of improving the habitat, it's a major challenge. 94% of the Wharfe, I would say, has been entirely shackled by artificial banks. And that effectively sets the river in aspect. A river should be a dynamic system. We should be giving rivers space to move, to thrive, to live, to breathe, to take on their special characters, the sort of things that Amy Jones was talking about before. We don't do that. Compare and contrast. Here's A and B. Hubberholme, Ilkley, if you like. I'm not saying it's straight as a die from Hutherham to Ilkley, but it's been straightened for the majority of it. And of course, a straighter channel is shorter and it's steeper. Obviously, the flow through that section then is quicker, and that leads to more erosive power at Ilkley, here to be. In those shorter, steeper, straighter sections, the smaller sediments, the gravels, the really important bits for things like trout and river flies, they're gone. And of course, if the river's been straightened and constrained, there's no opportunity for new gravels to get reintroduced into the river. So it's dominated by riffle, it's a boring trapezoidal cross-section in terms of cross-profile. So in terms of the physical condition of the channel, it's got low channel diversity, low habitat quality. Because it's been engineered, we've generally got poor riparian quality as well. So that riparian zone is the bit between the land and the water. You saw in that photograph of the long bend, that's all boulders and all material that's been dragged out of the river. Not great rooting material, so that's why there are no trees along that long sweeping bend. So overall then, we've got low ecological functionality. Compare and contrast to the Wiggy section, obviously longer, slower, less erosive, lots of opportunity for erosion on the outside of bends, but deposition on the inside of bends. So we're retaining gravels, we've got a nice mix of smooth, rippled and glides. Great variability in terms of its great variability in terms of its cross section, and therefore high channel diversity, higher habitat quality, generally better riparian quality. Obviously, that depends on the management around it, and generally better functionality. So if we can get some physical diversity, we should get some biological diversity. And that's what we try and do, is restore this mosaic, to restore the functionality. Quite a bit of that, as I said, if we can't let the river wander around, and I would argue we should be trying to create space for the river, then it's about reinvigorating the riparian, that zone along the edge. Trees matter. Trout do grow on trees. You can quote me on that. As I said, I'm an aquatic ecology professor. This is a paper by some colleagues of mine with some of my PhD students. No matter where you go, to whichever river in the country, be it a soft chalk stream down south or a proper northern spate river, 50% of the biomass of the trout in those rivers is derived from the terrestrial zone, the land around it. So, yes, I'm biased, trout are amazing, but 50% of what they are made up of comes from the land. So you need to think about the quality of the land that surrounds the river as well. So quite a lot of the work that we do could be very simple and relatively cheap interventions, like excluding the livestock, to stop the erosion of the banks, to stop the defecation of the livestock directly in the water. Just to add my own little fact there, if a cow steps into the water, it's 5 times more likely to defecate. I'll provide the reference for that afterwards. So, for example, I've only been working for the Wild Trout Trust here in Yorkshire for 7 years, but I think I've probably been responsible for about 10 kilometres of riparian fencing and about 25,000 trees which are going in to provide shade for the future and leaf litter and other sorts of wonderful inputs like that. Just to put some little case studies together, this is a great Yorkshire name for a beck. It's not the real name, I came up with it. I don't think it actually has a name, but I call it El Dorado. And it's a tributary of the Wharfe, which is not a bad looking river, I have to admit. The main river Wharfe is in that sort of dotty white bit at the bottom, and this is the entire length of El Dorado. It's only 170 metres long. I call it El Dorado because it is the most important spawning tributary for the trout in this section of the Wharfe. I would wager that almost every single person in this room could step across El Dorado. Step across. It's that narrow. but it's incredibly important for trout spawning. So what we've done, we've encapsulated the whole lot of it. We've excluded livestock from the full Monty to restore the riparian. You can see the difference. This is a month and a half, I think, after the fence went in. So it's bowling green on the outside and quite darker there on the inside of the fence. We've augmented planting because you're right at the top end of the catchment there. That's tree planting. It's a very poor seed bank. And we're running out of time from a climate change perspective, I would say. We've accentuated some of those meanders, if not with boulders or little bits of wood, but also with the tree planting. And we've done some gravel addition there, just because the spec was a little bit straighter in the past. And Eldorado has a little sister next door, on which, even on a tiny little beck like that, it had been put in a culvert pipe. So we've ripped that culvert down. We've done similar work on whitebeck. So those of you that know whitebeck at Kilnsey, not a bad looking stream. I saw it when I first came up to Yorkshire too long ago, last century should we say, and I thought, well, that would be lovely if it wasn't bald as a coot and completely exposed to the harsh rays of the summer sun. Again, there we've fenced the riparian to restore that. We've augmented planting, we've accentuated some of the meanders, and we've added a lot of this woody material here. So that's not natural, I've put that there, and that's sorting the gravels and making it a bit better for the spawning. And what does that look like? Here's some, here's a graph. Sorry about that. Well, I had to show it, but there's a pun in there, and there's a little bit of well, I call this project Trout, and it's tackling resilience on underperforming tributaries. It's a stretch, I know, thank you. But it's effectively about improving the spawning and the fry habitat, trying to cope with that weakest link and give these populations a bit of a chance. And it's reliant on an ecological hypothesis called the field of dreams. So if you build it, they will come and use it. They have the ability to do so. So here's Eldorado, here's Dalbergill, which is Wharfe, I'm afraid it's nid, but take it. Here's Whitebeck, and here are two control streams over a 3-year period. So 2020 for these systems was pre-intervention. Obviously the control streams have had nothing done to improve them, and you can see the black dotted lines there for control 1 and control 2. I won't name them because people get a little bit upset when I say their becks are rubbish. But I am going to be working on these in the future, so they'll be controlled. And you can see that over that time period, they've flatlined, or actually they're in slight decline. There's noise in there, but it's flat. Whereas where we've been doing these interventions, this is proportional change in just the young of year trout. So we're talking 70 to 90 millimetre long trout, very cute, perfection in miniature. And we're getting 3 times the number on average in some of these systems, particularly in Eldorado. 3 times the number of young of year produced in those systems. Martin introduced the concept of, well, and Amy Jane introduced the concept of connectivity before, and I guess I'm reasonably famous in the Yorkshire area for getting rid of redundant structures. The Industrial Revolution put a lot of structures into our rivers, driving hydropower, bringing us forward in terms of mechanisation and all that sort of thing, but these structures are redundant now for the most part. They're failing, and they are an incredible lasting legacy on our natural heritage. And I'm sorry, but I'm more interested in the natural heritage than built heritage. So this is it's not on the wharf, I'm afraid. It's constant cold on the air, but this was 2 sets of before and after pictures, fixed point photography. So the left-hand panel, top left, before, bottom left, after, top right, before, bottom right is the same, exactly the same position after. Okay, that's just removing a 19 metre wide, 1.4 metre high weir and getting the river back to what it should actually look like. Being able to transport all that wonderful gravel down the river if it wants to, getting it back to the natural proportions. Instead of being 19 metres wide, it's about 5 metres wide at that point. Just as many trout, if not more, there now. And of course, they can go upstream or downstream whenever they want. This is another sort of culvert that people don't tend to think about on these much smaller tributaries, the really important arteries of these river systems. They're littered with obstructions like this. And as you can see, that trout is failing, demonstrably failing to get through that barrier. We had a similar situation, again, on the Wharfe example, but I've got plenty lined up to tackle on the Wharfe, things like the bottom of Backstone Beck. There's one of those, or two of those at the bottom of Backstone Beck, and I'm desperately trying to get rid of those. Here's some data, much shorter time frame, 2021, before we removed the culvert, 2022, after we removed the culvert. 2021 is the blue data, 22 is the red data. You can see there are 3 times the number of young of year trout this year than there were last year. To put that into wider perspective, I don't have the data to show you currently, although if you think back to the previous shot, 2021 was a good spawning year. 2022 has been a bad spawning year for most becks, and yet where we've given them the opportunity to get to good habitat, they will do it, they will perform. Okay, so I was asked to think about conflicts, challenges and opportunities, and as Charlotte will know, I quite often take the opportunity to be a little bit provocative on these sorts of things. So I see this as a thing of beauty. Here's a tree in a river. It was going to fall down, it was going to fall in. I tickled it a little bit and made sure that it's not going to disappear anywhere. Okay? Because if it falls in, quite likely on a river like this, it will get taken away. That was a trapezoidal cross-section channel. Flat, boring, low habitat quality. Since we've put that tree in, this side is now a nice gravel bank, and therefore the focus of the flow is down that side underneath the shot. We need to get over our inherent need to tidy, I would say. Can't think about rivers as these conveyance channels and getting rid of our water. That's what we're really good at. That's what we've been doing for 200 years. Look at where it's got us now. Especially in these drought conditions. We've got no water left. Great. The other thing is, we've got to embrace the dynamism of rivers. They need to move about. Erosion is a good thing, or it can be a good thing. Okay, if it's against the bottom of your house, then that's not such a great thing. But where a river can move and should be moving, why not let it move? Here's a case in point where potentially we would have some issues if there's a separate landowner on one side versus the other, but this guy approached us the other day and said, what can we do about the river? It's moving a lot. Can we get it back into its original course? I hate those words. You can see that the river has been over there because all of that bank is made up of alluvial gravel. It's been there in the past. It's just going back there. So we need to get over, or we need to get past the fact that erosion is okay. It can be embraced, and there's no such thing as its original course. A river should be dynamic. Second point, where I'm going to be a little bit provocative. I think we've seen this place before. I really appreciate my connection with rivers and other people's connections with rivers if they are respectful. And I don't think COVID has helped us in that sort of situation. What I've tried to highlight in this talk is that the riparian zone is incredibly fragile and it's very easy to abuse. Obviously this is an extreme case in point. A honey pot, everybody piles down there, they're appreciating the river in some sort of way, but there's all sorts of downsides to having loads of people going along the river. And if we look to quite a few of our Dales rivers, this is the case in point here in Grassington, we've got footpaths right the way along the side of them. And getting a natural, functional riparian zone is quite often at odds even with just a footpath. So we've got to be really careful in terms of balancing these needs. And the last incendiary bomb, which I'll just throw in there, is some of the policies that we have that focus on a particular species, and that's rich because I represent the Wild Trout Trust. But as I've tried to tell you, we're using it as a totemic species. Some of these schemes that will protect a particular pair of curlews, for example, but ignore the fact that we could convert a scheme to X amount of hectares of forestry, which will promote 10 species of equal conservation concern and have all sorts of benefits far-reaching down the river. I think we've got a lot of work to do on that sort of thing. So, my final slide, before I get kicked, is why I became fascinated in rivers in the first instance is because I couldn't see beneath the surface. That's my connection, if we're thinking back to Amy's talk, Amy Jones' talk. And I was fascinated by what must be going on beneath the surface, and that's why I've chased blue skies research in academia for about 30 years. And it's that, what's going on beneath the surface, which still drives me to be who I am, what I'm doing now. What I think we need to be doing, yes, there's a sort of groundswell towards moving towards landscape scale recovery, and lots of big projects coming online. Unfortunately, I see quite a lot of those that are driven from the land perspective from the very outset. And there's a sort of inherent assumption there that if we're getting it right for the land, then the water will probably be okay, because quite a lot of the crap, if you excuse my French, comes off the land and goes into the water. But as I've tried to point out here, we'll struggle for a long time if we don't give the rivers the space that they need to be able to function properly from a physical perspective. So we need, I think, to be thinking about them first from the very outset. Thank you.